Today we're listing the top 10 cards in Warhammer Underworlds that deserve a reprint. Hello and welcome to the Miscast table. My name is Måns, and today we're going to talk about the top 10 cards that have rotated out of the championship format but deserves to be reprinted and make it into the format once again. So we're talking about cards that were printed before DÖRR Chasm. And I've chosen these cards based on what they bring to the game mechanic wise, where a card scores highly if it adds something interesting and fun to the game. So this is not a list of the 10 strongest cards from the earlier seasons. This is a list of 10 cards that have interesting mechanics that I think could add something to the current championship format. And if you have any cards that you think should be reprinted, let me know which ones and why down in the comments below. And we're also getting kind of close to the 1000 subs milestone, so a subscription right now to help us reach that would be greatly appreciated. But with that, let's get into the video, starting with number 10. Number 10, Wild Form. Spell. This spell is cast if there are 2 or more of the same symbol in the casting roll. If this spell is cast, plus 1 damage to the caster's range 1 and range 2 attack actions. And they gain 1 or more of the following, corresponding to the symbols in the roll. 2 channel, plus 1 move, 2 focus, plus 1 wounds, 2 crits, plus 1 defense. This spell persists until the caster is taken out of action. So we're starting off with a weird one. A spell that requires doubles of any kind to be cast, and on top of that one of the effects that you get is random. And normally I don't like spells that requires double to be cast, because they are so unlikely to be cast, even if you have a level 2 wizard. But this one is a bit different because it requires doubles of any kind to be cast, which makes it a little bit better, but it's quite marginal. But the reason I do like this card is because it's very unique. It's also a really fun card, it's a fun effect, and it has the correct kind of randomness. And playing this card feels a little bit like playing on a slot machine. You roll 2 dice, you hope to get doubles, but you're not sure what you're gonna get beforehand. But whatever result you get, you're pretty happy because all of the effects are pretty good. And the reason that you can feel good about any of the results that you get is because you always get the plus 1 damage to range 1 and range 2 attack. And that effect in of itself is really good, and the other random effects that you get is basically just gravy. And while there might be effects that you want more than others, there's never really gonna be a feels bad moment because of the randomness, since you always get this effect. And this effect is really good. 1 plus damage to range 1 and range 2 attacks is the same as Great Strength. And Great Strength is a card that is good enough to be included in almost any deck. I probably use it in like 90-95% of all the decks that I build. And add this together with the effect of 1 plus move, which is great speed, or 1 plus wounds, which is great fortitude, or 1 plus defense, an effect that is too strong to be printed on a universal card unconditionally. It does exist as some faction specific cards, but add one of these effects together with great strength and you have a super strong card. But it is a spell and it does need to be casted and it requires doubles, and that balances it out in my opinion. And considering all that, I consider Wild Form to be an example of great card design, and I would love to see it back into the current championship format. Number 9. Stand and Shoot. Reaction. Play this after an enemy fighter's move action that is part of a charge action. Choose a friendly fighter that is adjacent to them and make an attack action with that fighter that has a range of 3 or more. It must target the enemy fighter, and that fighter cannot be driven back by this attack action. While Warhammer Underworlds does have both shooting and magic, I don't think anyone would be willing to argue with me when I say that melee is the most dominant playstyle. And therefore things that help out the other 2 playstyles makes me really happy. And the ability to injure or kill an enemy fighter as he or she closes the gap is a really good one. And the mere fact that this card is in rotation is gonna affect the way that people play against ranged fighters. You have a fighter with 1 life, do you really dare charge an enemy fighter with a range 3 attack, knowing that they might have this in their hand? Maybe your fighter has more life, maybe it won't die from the range 3 attack, but maybe it becomes easy prey for one of your opponent's other fighters. This is a card that creates tension and excitement just by being in rotation, and I really like that. And the stand and shoot mechanic is a really common one in other Games Workshop games, so it certainly has its place in Underworlds as well. Number 8. Hoarder. Score this in the 3rd end phase if you have at least 9 unspent glory points. very similar to the card Frugal that is also out of rotation. And now you might be thinking, well, hold on Mons, both of these cards are just win more cards. You score these when you already have tons of glory, the rich gets richer and so on. And I guess you're not really wrong in thinking that. However, I would argue that you could build a deck around these cards using illusionary upgrades, which would greatly increase the amount of unspent glory points that you have available. You score more than 9 glory points in most games, more than 3 almost always, but it's not that common that you have 9 unspent ones in the end, unless you're actively not playing your upgrades or you're scoring really well. The risk of course with building around these cards and putting them in your deck is of course that you could draw them very early and then you have a problem. But the reason I do like these cards is because they interact with glory points in an interesting way, and I think they could also help the illusionary upgrade playstyle become more viable. And cards that open doors to more variety is always welcome in my opinion. Number 7. Sudden Scarcity. The next time an opponent spends any glory points to give a fighter an upgrade, they must spend 1 additional glory point to do so. This effect persists until the end of the phase. Hindering your opponent from playing upgrades, or at least slowing them down, is a really interesting mechanic. And if you have this card on hand in the beginning of the game, where unspent glory points is at a premium, it's also really good. And the means to be able to interfere with your opponent's ability of playing cards is not that common in Warhammer Underworlds. And this is one of those cards that are really good at keeping an opponent from getting too far ahead, but it's also really good when you are ahead at keeping your opponent from being able to catch back up. And it's in play for the entire phase until your opponent decides to spend the extra glory point to give his fighter an upgrade anyway. The downside of this card of course is that it's quite common in the later stages of the game that you have quite a lot of unspent glory points, at which point this card is basically a dead card. But I think most people would be really happy to have this in the starting hand. And I for one would love to try this out in the current championship format, so let's make Sudden Scarcity less scarce again. Number 6. Overpower. Score this immediately when a friendly fighter successfully casts a spell if there are 1 or more crits in the casting roll. Magic is not in a great spot, and it never really has been. But this card could help the situation just a little bit. With a level 2 wizard, the likelihood that you will have scored this card after just 1 cast is about 30%. The chance that you will have done it after 2 casts is about 50%, and it's about 67% after the 3rd. Assuming of course that you're casting spells that only need 1 result to succeed. And this card somewhat reminds me of Unequal Contest and Equal Contest. There are just cards that get scored as the game progresses. And if you're playing a magic heavy playstyle, this card should work the same way. There are cards like Harvest the Storm and Soulbinding that is just like better versions of this card, but they are both warband specific. But compared to other cards in rotation right now, like Myriad Incantations, Predatory Spell, Competent Conjurer, this card is often just better. But not only that, it also fits really well with the before mentioned cards, and that makes it a great addition to the current Magic playstyle. It also works great together with my new favorite card, Waltz Mysterium, but that is completely unrelated of course. Number 5. Look Out. Reaction. Play this during an attack action that will damage your leader. Roll a defense die. On a roll of single support, double support or crit, choose a friendly fighter adjacent to them. That fighter suffers the damage instead, then 1 additional damage, and no fighters are driven back. Not to be mistaken for the card Noble Sacrifice, even though the wording and effect is incredibly similar. But honestly I would be happy if either one was reprinted. And the reason I like this card quite a lot is because I've been playing a lot with the Dread Pageant warband specific card Shared Pain. And yes, Shared Pain is a lot better, it is unconditional, you don't need to roll for it, and it also has a range of 3 hexes instead of being adjacent. But a card like Shared Pain would be way too strong if it was a universal card, but the fact that you need to roll for Lookout and you also need to be adjacent makes it a lot more balanced and fair. And I like this card because I think it's really nice to be able to protect your fighters in other ways than just defensive upgrades. And some warbands are also more dependent on their leaders, and being able to defend him or her is a really good ability to have. And some of you might argue that what is basically a get out of jail free card for the leader when this succeeds is a bit too much. But you must also remember that the fighter that takes the hit from the leader takes the full damage from the attack plus 1 additional damage. And that makes it quite likely that that fighter is taken out of action. So you don't really get off scot-free either. Number 4, distraction. Choose one enemy fighter and push them 1 hex. And for many this might be an obvious pick, it is Sidestep's annoying brother. And push cards in general is a great inclusion in most decks, and you can almost always find a use for them. It's very rare that a push card is a dead card, but as of late Games Workshop has severely limited the amount of cards with which you can push your opponent's fighter with. And I'm not sure why that is, especially since lethal hexes is not such a big part of the game anymore since we have gloom hexes instead. And basically the only card with which you can reliably push your opponent's fighter right now is probably Center of Attention. And some of you might agree with the fact that it's a good thing that we're moving away from the ability to push your opponent's fighters, but I don't think it's a good thing. We used to have cards like Earthquake and Great Concussion, and I for one think that the ability to push enemy fighters is fun. And with that I also believe that distraction was good for the game, so bring it back. Number 3, Spine-Toed Toxin. Choose one enemy fighter adjacent to one or more friendly fighters. The enemy fighter is dealt 1 damage after each move action they make. The effect persists until the enemy fighter is taken out of action. This is one of those cards that people who played in Beastgrave when this was in rotation might have mixed feelings about. And at first glance, this card might seem really similar to other cards like Cruel Pangs, Spinefin Toxin, Suffocating Mists, or Rippling Mists, all cards that can be used to deal 1 damage to an enemy fighter when the conditions is right. And you also have a card like Rocksnake Toxin that deals 1 damage in the end of every action phase. But what all these cards have in common is that they are really hard to play around. Avoiding objectives and cover hexes out of fear that your opponent might have one of these cards on hand is not a viable strategy. Rocksnake Toxin is straight up unavoidable, and trying not to be adjacent to Spinefin when it teleports across the entire map is easier said than done. And what makes Spine-Toed Toxin different is while it might be unavoidable, it will never mean instant death. You can play around this card, and it does add something interesting to the game. Do I move here and take damage, or do I just stay put? Do I really dare to charge when it means I'm gonna take 1 damage? And if your fighter only has 1 wound remaining, it cannot move for the rest of the game, or else it will kill itself, which is quite the bummer, but your fighter can still be activated and interacted with, which is way more fun than being insta-killed with one of the other cards. And it also adds a really fun strategic element in my opinion, so I think we should bring Spinefin Toxin back. Number 2, at any cost. Spend 3 glory points. If you do, choose one friendly fighter with no charge or move tokens. That fighter makes a charge action. So here's the thing. In the beginning of the game, unspent glory points is a really important resource to be able to play upgrade. But you rarely need more than like 7 glory points to play all the upgrades that you're gonna draw throughout the game. So what tends to happen is that during the mid game you suddenly have more unspent glory points than you need to be able to play all the upgrades that you have on hand. And at that point unspent glory points stop being a resource of value. And yes, the more glory points you have, the more likely you are to win the game of course, but as a spendable resource, unspent glory points loses their value after you have collected somewhere between like 7 or 8 glory points. And prolonging the usefulness of unspent glory points as a resource is a great thing in my opinion. And the card at any cost does exactly that. So you play this card and you spend 3 glory points for a charge action. And this what is basically an activation actually worth 1 card and 3 unspent glory points. And I'm not really sure to be honest, it's really hard to determine the value of an activation versus the value of a card. But a card like this helps prolong the life of a game mechanic, the unspent glory points, and keeps them useful even in the later stages of the game. And there are also cards like Astrolith Igniter, Enhanced Blow, Weirding Staff, Buried Treasure that works in a similar way with unspent glory points. However, cards that rely on you being able to spend unspent glory points can quite easily also become win more cards. If you have loads of glory, you can play these cards freely without a second thought, and if you don't, they're basically dead cards. So putting these cards into your deck is quite a balancing act and you don't want too many of them. But a really fun strategy with a card like this would be to build a deck full of illusionary upgrades, and then you'll have loads of glory over to spend on gamuts like these, since you don't need them for upgrades anyways. So as a conclusion, the card at any cost does bring longevity to a game mechanic, and it also makes the game more interesting. So in my book, it deserves a reprint. Number 1, Disturbing Presence. Enemy fighters adjacent to this fighter cannot make charge actions. So we have arrived at number 1, and I doubt that any of you could have guessed that this would be my number 1 pick, so let me explain. So the ability to hinder an opponent's movements and or hindering their ability to take actions is not a super common ability in Warhammer Underworlds. And it's also the one that is quite hard to balance, but I think it's really good that these kind of abilities exist. And there are, for example, upgrades with attack actions that gives the target a charge token when the attack is successful, for example. I'm talking about cards like Touch of Death, Barblade and Net, and Soul Tooth Net, for example. And there's also upgrades like Stunning Blow and Kinetic Lodestone. And the ability to give a fighter a charge token is incredibly powerful. And that's why these upgrades come with lots of restrictions. First of all, you have to play the card, you have to make a successful attack action, and most of these cards come with other restrictions as well. These other ones are also warband specific and they can be played around. And when a fighter has a charge token, it cannot be activated at all. It is completely vulnerable for the rest of the round. And the ability to be able to do this to an opponent's fighter is, in my opinion, 1, too strong, and 2, not very fun. However, Disturbing Presence is the perfect middle ground. There's no need for successful attack actions or anything like that. Just play the upgrade, be adjacent to an enemy fighter, and they cannot perform charge actions. And this is a good ability that can be used to tie down your opponent's powerful fighters that he or she might want to charge with. And this without taking them out of play completely, as is the case when you give them a charge token. And I think this card is really well balanced, and it's also less conditional than the charge token ones, while still giving the targeted player the ability to counterplay. Your opponent could, for example, make an attack action against the holder of this card, they can also just move out of range, and so on. This is the perfect disruption card in my opinion, and it's an example of great card design, and I would love to see this make a comeback into the championship format. So that was my list of the top 10 cards currently out of the championship rotation that deserves to be reprinted and make a comeback. And this was of course my choices and my reasoning why these cards should be reprinted. And whether you agree or disagree with my list, I would love to hear why in the comments down below. And I'll see you all in the next one. Bye.